The camera slowly drifts through the shining halls of a luxurious restaurant, where chefs in spotless uniforms rush about with sharp knives and sizzling pans. In the middle of this fast-paced chaos stands an old black man with wrinkled hands, a slightly bent back, and tired eyes. His apron is faded, stained with years of work, and his shoes look worn from endless hours on his feet. He is not there to cook, not there to serve, only to clean. While others chop vegetables with pride and plate dishes with confidence, he quietly pushes his mop across the floor, blending into the background like furniture no one notices. But not everyone ignores him. Some of the younger chefs watch him with smirks. They whisper jokes, nudging each other, chuckling as though his very existence is a punchline. "Look at him, moving slower than the soup boils," one of them mocks. Another chef pretends to hand him a mop like it's a trophy, and the kitchen erupts in laughter. To them, he is nothing more than a worn-out shadow in their world of glamour. Too old, too slow, too invisible to matter. What none of them realize, however, is that this man, this nobody in their eyes, carries a secret. A story hidden behind his silence, a skill buried beneath years of struggle. In just a short while, the very same people laughing at him will be left speechless, their pride shattered, their arrogance burned away, all by a single dish. This is not just a story about food. It's the story of an old man the world forgot, until the day he reminded everyone of his worth, with a taste so powerful, it changed everything. His name was Samuel Green, but inside this grand restaurant, hardly anyone cared enough to know it. To the young chefs, the waiters, and even the manager, he was simply the old man with a mop. A ghost in the kitchen, always present but never acknowledged. Samuel would shuffle through the shiny floors with his bucket and broom, bowing his head politely when someone brushed past him, always careful not to get in the way. He never raised his voice. He never complained. Day after day, he came before dawn, long before the kitchen smelled of garlic and butter, and left late at night, after the laughter of the last customers had faded into silence. His hands, calloused, scarred, and wrinkled, had cleaned spills, carried crates heavier than his own body, and scrubbed pots until they shone brighter than the chandeliers above the dining hall. But behind his tired eyes, there was something no one noticed. When Samuel looked at the cutting boards, the gleaming stoves, and the racks of knives, there was a flicker, like a secret conversation between an old friend and a memory. Once, long ago, those tools had been his companions. Once, Samuel wasn't just a cleaner. He was a young man with a fire in his heart and a dream larger than life itself. To become a chef, to feed the world not just food, but love, culture, and soul. Life, however, is not always kind. Hardship had forced him to trade the chef's hat for a janitor's rag. But Samuel never let bitterness take root. Instead, he wore his silence like armor, his humility like a crown. He greeted everyone with a gentle nod, humming little jazz tunes his father used to play on an old record player. Some laughed at him, some ignored him, but Samuel had learned one of life's hardest lessons. Not every battle needs a response. What no one in that restaurant knew, what not even Samuel himself realized, was that destiny was quietly watching him, waiting for the perfect moment to call him back into the spotlight. Because sometimes, the very people the world overlooks are the ones destined to leave it speechless. Every kingdom has its ruler, and in this restaurant, the throne belonged to Chef Damien Clark, a tall, sharp-dressed man in his early 40s with a chef's coat whiter than snow and an ego larger than the building itself. To the customers, Damien was a genius. His name sparkled on billboards, his photo graced glossy magazines, and his recipes were praised as modern masterpieces. But inside the kitchen walls, his reputation told another story. Damien was feared more than respected. His voice boomed louder than the sizzling pans, barking orders like a drill sergeant. A single grain of salt misplaced, a sauce stirred a second too long, and he would lash out in a storm of insults sharp enough to slice through steel. His staff, though skilled, walked on eggshells, terrified of becoming the next target of his wrath. And yet, despite all his so-called brilliance, Damien had one particular pastime he enjoyed most. Not creating recipes, not mentoring his team, but mocking Samuel. Whenever Samuel passed by with his mop, Damien's lips curled into a cruel smirk. "Careful, old man," he'd sneer. "Don't slip and break those ancient bones of yours. We wouldn't want to lose the best janitor in town." The kitchen staff would erupt into forced laughter, some out of loyalty to Damien, others simply afraid of crossing him. Samuel, as always, would bow his head politely and continue his work, swallowing the insult with the same quiet patience he carried every day. But Damien wasn't done. On days when he was particularly restless, he'd throw scraps of food toward Samuel. "Hey, cleaner, here's something fancy for you. French fries a la trash bin." His words dripped with arrogance, feeding his ego as the younger cooks giggled nervously. To Damien, Samuel was invisible, insignificant, an easy target to remind everyone who truly ruled the kitchen. What Damien failed to realize, however, was that the man he treated like dirt was carrying a fire inside him that no amount of mockery could extinguish. And soon, fate would set the stage for a clash neither Damien nor anyone else in that glittering kitchen could ever forget. It was a Friday evening, the busiest night of the week. The restaurant buzzed with laughter, clinking glasses, and the clatter of silverware. Every table was filled, and the air was thick with the smell of garlic butter, roasted herbs, and expensive wine. But this was no ordinary night. Word had spread that Victor Leblanc, a world-renowned food critic whose pen could make or break a restaurant's future, was coming to dine. The entire staff moved like soldiers preparing for battle. Waiters ironed their uniforms twice. Dishes were polished until they reflected faces. And in the kitchen, every chef sharpened their knives to perfection. The pressure was suffocating, because one bad review from Leblanc and Damien's glittering empire could crumble overnight. Damien strutted around the kitchen with his usual arrogance, barking orders louder than ever. "Faster, sharper, cleaner. This is the night we prove we're the best." His voice was thunder, and nobody dared to breathe wrong. Then, disaster struck. In the middle of preparing his signature dish, Damien suddenly winced, clutching his wrist. A sharp pain twisted across his face. He had been ignoring an old injury for months, but tonight, the strain of chopping and plating pushed it too far. His knife slipped, nearly slicing his hand. The kitchen froze. Damien cursed under his breath, trying to continue, but the pain forced him to drop the pan. His hand trembled violently. Gasps echoed through the staff. Without Damien, the entire menu was at risk. The sous chefs looked at each other nervously, their confidence fading. This was not a night for experiments. This was a night for perfection. And without Damien, perfection seemed impossible. The manager's face turned pale. Sweat dripped down his forehead as he whispered, "What do we do now? If we fail tonight, we're finished." The kitchen, once roaring with noise, suddenly felt heavy with silence. All eyes darted nervously across the room, until, by pure chance, they landed on a figure quietly sweeping near the back. "Samuel." The old man paused, his mop still in his hand, as though he had just been caught in a spotlight he never asked for. The air shifted. Whispers spread like fire. "Don't tell me. No, they are not seriously thinking about him." And in that single, fragile moment, destiny took its first breath. The silence in the kitchen was thick, broken only by the hiss of a boiling pot no one remembered to stay. All eyes remained on Samuel, who still stood frozen with a mop in his hands. The idea alone, that this old janitor might touch a frying pan on the most important night of the restaurant's life, felt ridiculous. And then, the laughter began. It started as a snicker from one of the younger cooks, then spread like wildfire until the entire kitchen shook with cruel chuckles. One chef leaned against the counter, clutching his stomach, barely able to breathe from laughing. Another wiped fake tears from his eyes and said, "Oh, this is rich. What's next?" The dishwasher conducting the orchestra. Even the waiters passing by joined in, peeking through the swinging doors to catch a glimpse of the spectacle. The old man, cooking for Victor Leblanc, one whispered in disbelief. "He can't even carry a tray without his knees cracking." Chef Damien, though in pain, couldn't resist sneering. With a smirk that cut deeper than any knife, he growled. What a joke. A mop in his hand is the only tool he knows. Cooking? Huh. The day Samuel cooks a masterpiece is the day pigs fly across this kitchen. The staff erupted again, the sound of their laughter bouncing off the steel counters and tiled walls like cruel echoes. Samuel lowered his eyes. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He simply tightened his grip on the mop, his face calm, unreadable. To the staff, his silence was weakness. But deep inside, a storm was brewing, quiet, controlled, and waiting for its moment to strike. What none of them realized was that while they laughed at Samuel, fate was laughing at them. Because destiny has a habit of turning the tables, and the same people who mocked him tonight would soon be left in awe, with mouths wide open, not from laughter, but from shock. The laughter echoed through the kitchen like cruel thunder, bouncing off pots and pans, piercing through Samuel's quiet heart. Yet while others bent over with amusement, Samuel stood still. His eyes didn't flinch, his lips didn't tremble. He simply placed the mop back into its bucket with a calmness that made the laughter slowly lose its rhythm. He wiped his hands on his faded apron and took a single step forward. The room, for a brief second, seemed to pause, as if even the sizzling pans leaned in to listen. Samuel's voice, low but steady, broke the noise. Let me try. Just one dish. The laughter stopped, not because they respected him, but because they couldn't believe what they had just heard. Chefs stared at each other in disbelief. A waiter almost dropped a tray of glasses. Damien raised his eyebrow, smirking, his voice dripping with venom. You? Cook? Do you even know the difference between saffron and salt? A ripple of chuckles followed, but this time it was weaker, less confident. Something about the way Samuel stood, his back straight, his eyes steady, felt different. Samuel didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply repeated, more firmly this time. One dish. That's all I ask. For a moment, the kitchen was caught in a strange silence. Nobody had ever seen Samuel speak with such conviction. The same man they mocked for years was suddenly standing before them with a quiet confidence that demanded attention. The manager, desperate and sweating under the weight of the critics' looming judgment, looked around the room. Every professional chef seemed paralyzed with fear, unwilling to risk humiliation on such a night. And so, his gaze slowly returned to Samuel, the janitor with nothing but wrinkled hands and an unshakable calm. It was madness. It was impossible. And yet, it might be the only chance they had. The air in the kitchen hung heavy, thick with tension and disbelief. Samuel's quiet request echoed in everyone's ears. One dish. That's all I ask. Yet instead of encouragement, the room filled with whispers, hushed but sharp enough for him to hear. Is he serious? One young cook muttered, shaking his head. He'll ruin everything, another whispered, clutching a ladle like it was a shield. A waiter leaned in close to a colleague and hissed, if LeBlanc tastes anything less than perfect, we're all out of jobs. And we're trusting him. The staff's eyes darted nervously toward the dining hall, where the critic sat at his table, sipping wine with the patience of a king awaiting his feast. Each tick of the clock felt like a hammer pounding against their ribs. The manager's face turned pale, torn between desperation and logic. On one hand, he knew Samuel was never more than a cleaner, a shadow in the corner of the kitchen. On the other hand, with Damien clutching his wrist and every other chef paralyzed by fear, Samuel was, unbelievably, the only option left. Damien scoffed, his pride refusing to die even through the pain. Let him try, manager. Give him the pan. Let him humiliate himself in front of the greatest critic alive. It'll be entertaining, at least. Laughter flickered again among the staff, but weaker this time, uncertain. Beneath the arrogance, there was doubt, not about Samuel's ability, but about what would happen if he failed. All Samuel did was look up, his eyes calm yet unyielding. There was no fear in them, only quiet resolve. For a man with nothing left to lose, doubt had no power. But for everyone else in that room, doubt was a storm, and it was about to decide whether they would sink or rise. The manager's trembling hand finally placed a pan on the counter in front of Samuel. The kitchen staff gathered close, some smirking, others curious, but all of them waiting for disaster. Damien leaned against the wall, his injured wrist wrapped in cloth, a cruel grin on his face. "Go ahead, old man. Show us your magic." Samuel didn't reply. Instead, he stepped forward with a grace that silenced the whispers. He rolled up his faded sleeves, washed his hands with slow precision, and tied his worn apron tighter around his waist. For the first time in years, he wasn't holding a mop. He was holding a knife. And that's when it began. The moment Samuel's blade touched the vegetables, the kitchen changed. The sharp tack-tack-tack of his chopping was steady, rhythmic, almost musical. His hands, though wrinkled and weathered, moved with the elegance of a dancer and the certainty of a master. He sliced onions so fine they looked like silk threads, diced herbs with a speed that left even the sous chefs blinking in disbelief. As oil hit the pan with a sharp hiss, Samuel's movements became a performance. He swirled the pan, tossed ingredients, sprinkled spices not with hesitation but with instinct, like an artist painting on a blank canvas. Steam rose, carrying with it aromas so rich and layered that even the loudest mockers fell silent, their noses twitching, their eyes wide. For the first time, the staff saw him not as a janitor, not as an old man, but as something entirely different, a conductor orchestrating a symphony with nothing but food, fire, and memory. Damien's smirk began to fade. The critic in the dining hall lifted his head, as though he, too, could sense the magic seeping from the kitchen. And Samuel? He didn't look nervous. He didn't look proud. He simply cooked as if he had been as Samuel stirred the simmering sauce. The rich aroma filled the kitchen, wrapping the air like a warm blanket. The clatter of the pan behind his steady hands and calm face. When he was a young man in drifted far from the standing in his mother's small kitchen. For Samuel, he remembered the way cooking wasn't just gospel songs. It was teaching him how to season gumbo with heart, not just with salt. He could almost hear her laugh echoing in his ears as he mimicked her movements, a boy with fire in his soul and dreams too big for his little home. Years later, his passion carried him across the ocean, to the cobbled streets of Paris. He trained under masters whose names were whispered like legends. Back then, Samuel was not the cleaner. He was the rising star, the young black chef who defied expectations in kitchens where very few men like him were welcomed. He remembered the applause he once received for a dish so delicate, it brought a French critic to tears. But life is not always fair. A sudden tragedy, a family illness, bills that piled higher than dreams, doors that closed harder than they opened, forced Samuel to abandon the chef's coat. He traded his knives for odd jobs, his recipes for silence. Cooking became a ghost that haunted him, a fire he had to bury deep within just to survive. And now, decades later, that buried fire had found its way back to the surface. Every chop of his knife, every swirl of the pan, every sprinkle of seasoning was not just food. It was his story. His laughter, his tears, his sacrifices, all poured into a single dish. The young chefs watched in awe, unaware they were witnessing not just a man cooking, but a man remembering who he truly was. The kitchen, once roaring with chatter and cruel laughter, had fallen into an uneasy silence. Only the sounds of Samuel's cooking remained, the rhythmic chopping, the gentle simmer, the hiss of oil kissing the hot pan. But then something began to happen, something no one could ignore. It started with a faint fragrance, drifting softly through the air, a blend of caramelized onions, roasted garlic, and herbs so perfectly balanced that it seemed almost unreal. The smell spread like a spell, weaving its way between the chefs, curling past the waiters, seeping through the swinging doors into the dining hall. One young cook, who only minutes ago had laughed the loudest, froze mid-task. His eyes widened. "Wait, do you smell that?" he whispered. Another inhaled deeply, her lips parting in shock. "It smells heavenly." Even Damien, leaning bitterly against the counter, couldn't stop his nose from twitching. He tried to hide it, folding his arms tighter, but the crease in his brow betrayed him. His pride fought hard, but his senses knew the truth. Samuel was creating something extraordinary. In the dining room, heads began to turn. Guests lifted their chins, curious, murmuring to each other about the rich, intoxicating aroma swirling through the air. And at the critic's table, Victor LeBlanc paused mid-sip of his wine. He set down the glass slowly, closing his eyes for just a moment as he breathed it in. The faintest flicker of a smile tugged at his lips. Back in the kitchen, no one dared to laugh anymore. The same man they mocked now had them leaning forward, eyes wide, mouths watering, as if drawn by an invisible string. Samuel walked on, silent and focused, his movements deliberate but graceful, like an artist lost in his masterpiece. The aroma had done what Samuel's words could not. It silenced the doubters. And for the first time, the staff weren't looking at a janitor. They were looking at a chef. The dish was ready. Samuel placed it on a porcelain plate with hands steady as stone. There was no showmanship, no unnecessary flair, just a quiet confidence, as if he knew the food would speak louder than any decoration ever could. The sauce shimmered under the kitchen lights, the steam rising like whispers of a forgotten secret. The staff held their breath as the waiter carried the plate out of the kitchen. Each step felt like a drumbeat of destiny. Thump, 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 until finally, the dish was placed before Victor LeBlanc. The critic, a man whose expression rarely betrayed emotion, leaned forward. His silver hair glistened under the chandelier, his sharp eyes examining the plate with the precision of a jeweler inspecting a diamond. He twirled his fork gently, cutting into the dish with deliberate slowness. The entire restaurant seemed to lean in at once. Glasses stopped clinking, conversations faded, even the air itself held still. In the kitchen, chefs crowded near the small window that peered into the dining hall. Damien, his arms crossed, wore a mocking smile, though his eyes betrayed nervousness. The manager's palms sweated, and Samuel, calm as ever, stood with his hands behind his back, silent but unshaken. LeBlanc lifted the first bite to his mouth. He paused, sniffed gently, then placed it on his tongue. And then, silence. He closed his eyes. His fork froze mid-air. The room tensed. Seconds stretched like hours. The critic's face was unreadable, locked in stillness. Staff whispered nervously, "Is that good? Is it bad? Why isn't he saying anything?" Then, slowly, something remarkable happened. His lips trembled. His throat tightened. A single tear welled in the corner of his eye, sliding down his cheek before he could stop it. The greatest critic alive, known for his iron heart and razor-sharp words, was crying. The restaurant gasped. And back in the kitchen, Samuel's expression didn't change. No pride, no arrogance. Just a small, humble smile, as if he had cooked not for a critic, not for applause, but for something far more sacred, the joy of touching a soul through food. For a moment, the entire restaurant was frozen in disbelief. The most feared food critic in the country sat there, tears glistening on his cheeks, staring down at Samuel's dish as though it were more than food, as though it were a memory, a dream, a piece of his soul returned to him. Victor LeBlanc set down his fork slowly, almost reverently, as if the bite he had just taken was too precious to disturb with haste. He dabbed his eyes with a napkin, cleared his throat, and finally spoke. "This," he whispered, his voice trembling, "this is not just cooking. This is home. This is childhood. This is love served on a plate." The words echoed through the silent hall. Gasps rippled across the tables, guests whispering in shock. Some even applauded softly, unsure if it was allowed but too moved to stay silent. Back in the kitchen, the staff exchanged stunned looks. The same cooks who mocked Samuel now stood pale-faced, their jaws slack. The laughter that had filled the room only minutes ago was gone, erased, replaced by awe.